working? It's working, okay. Good afternoon. I'm George Sheets, the director of the library, and happy to welcome you here for our latest installment of Bookstream Bites. A couple of reminders. If you've got a cell phone or a smartphone with you, please mute it, put it on airplane mode, something like that, so it doesn't ring during the presentation. We appreciate that. Second, if you would like to be on the mailing list to receive advance announcements of programs, the Bookstream Bites program, which is this, we have a sign-up sheet in the back, which Stacy is waving in the air right now. So just give us your name and email address, and we'll add you to the list. And we've got, there's 2 months left in this season, and we have program flyers on the table next to the clipboard, as well as I've got a flyer there for our One Book, One Batavia events. We have 2 events left in that series. So again, happy to welcome you here, and now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dan Hoefler, longtime Batavian, former member of the City Council, past president of the Rotary Club, president of the Batavia Historical Society Board of Directors, and I know you were on the Planning Commission, I think, at some point, maybe?
No.
Okay, that was Frank. That was Frank.
Historic preservation.
Historic preservation. A great guy. He has graciously agreed to appear on relatively short notice and give us a presentation that I'm very much looking forward to about the Star Spangled Banner. So without further ado, please give a warm Batavia welcome to Dan Hoefler.
George called me Sunday and said, Dan, are you available? And I said, sure, George, anything for the library and to help out with this program. I've spoken a couple times before, both of them on military topics, on the anniversary of D-Day a couple of years ago, and then before that about Pearl Harbor on their anniversary of the attack on December 7th. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry that Terry could not be here. George and I both know Terry very, very well. She is a member of our Rotary Club. Ever since she joined us, she has done a great job as a member. Last year she started a shredding event and recycling event of electronics, which we're doing again on June 10th out at the old Sam's Club. So if you need some stuff shredded, you know, please come out and see us. I think it's from 9 to 12 out at the old Sam's Club. So, and Terry works out at Fermilab. I want to just mention, you know, the fact that Terry is the environmental scientist for Fermilab out there. And there's a lot of work and restoration and other things that go on at Fermilab. So I'm sure she's disappointed that she could not be here today. So she has a health issue, and we're hoping that she gets better. I want to not speak too long because when are the Illini playing, Frank? When?
Not till 3:30.
Not till 3:30, so I promise to have you out of here before that. Yeah, it's great to see 2 of our, well, actually there were 3 teams this year that made it to postseasons, Bradley and in the NIT and Illinois and Northwestern in the NC2A. So I want to wish them both good luck. My son works at Northwestern, so they don't get any bonuses if they win any NCAA games. It doesn't work that way. How many of you watch The Big Bang Theory? Okay. The episodes where Sheldon and Amy record, I don't think it's called, is it a podcast? I guess it's a podcast.
Fun with Flags.
Fun with Flags. This is not Fun with Flags. But if you do watch the show, you do learn quite a bit about vexillology. Am I saying that right? Yeah, about flags. So I had been reading and talking about maybe doing this for the flag monument. In fact, I reached out to Linda Schilke to see if she wanted a presentation maybe as a fundraiser, talking about the flag and the Star Spangled Banner and its history. So I didn't have an opportunity to hear back from her. So I know one of the committee members, Peter's here. So if there's something that could be arranged, I'd be happy to do that to help raise some money for you folks, which is great because, you know, being the home of Flag Day, Dr. Segran, who lived, of course, right down the street on the avenue here. So this is a tribute not only to the people who are working on that monument, but also to Dr. Segran. Though I'm sure the people up in Wisconsin, where he lived for a period of time, are not happy that we're planting our flag, so to speak, here with the monument, because he lived in, I can't remember the town in Wisconsin. Wabaca, right. And they claim Flag Day for theirs. So it's always, the flag always raises interesting questions and comments and discussions. So, but it's great to be here again today to talk about the Star Spangled Banner. This is the cover of the book, Cultural Biography of the Star Spangled Banner. I'll say something about the author in a minute. This is one of the earliest printed covers for the sheet music for the Star Spangled Banner. I just wanted you to have that historical perspective here. The land of the free and the home of the brave. And it's interesting to note that, hang on a second, I gotta get my notes, that it was 3 days after the battle at Fort McHenry that the first lyrics to the Star Spangled Banner were actually published. It was exactly 3 days. It was published in the Baltimore newspaper. I'll move on to the next one. This is who Mark Claggy is. Mark is a professor at Michigan University. He really does a great job of weaving together the stories of the song and the nation it represents. He does both music theory, music history, cultural history at the University of Michigan. Very interesting gentleman. The book examines both the origins of the text of the music, alternative lyrics and translations, and the song's use, where we hear it mostly today in our culture, in sports, at times of war and for political protest. His argument is that the anthem's meaning reflects and is reflected by the nation's quest to become a more perfect union. And I think there is no other event in our recent nation's history than, I think it was 1 or 2 days after 9/11, and they were cleaning out where the towers stood, and you have that historic pose of the firemen putting the flag over the destroyed buildings. I mean, is there nothing that didn't pull our country together at that point? Did we feel a sense of unity? Well, that's what Francis Scott Key felt at Fort McHenry. That's what Mark is saying to us, that it is a symbol of unity. It is not a symbol of disunity. However, it can be used as a symbol of disunity, as we've seen in recent cultures, particularly out of the National Football League. And I'll say something more about that a little bit later. So from a victory song to hymn of sacrifice or a vehicle of protest, the story of the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, is the story of America. Now, how many of you have heard some of the different renditions that sometimes split us and sometimes make us glad we're Americans? And I've got two here, pictures. 1969, Jimi Hendrix, if you've never heard it, plays his guitar, and it's the first time that the Star Spangled Banner was recorded as a guitar solo that he did at Woodstock. Now, I don't know what your feelings about Woodstock are, but of course, for more mature Americans at that time, more conservatives, it was seen as totally disrespectful to the flag and to the song itself. But then there's another side of this 20 years later, or 30 years later, excuse me, where Whitney Houston at the 1991 Super Bowl sings that rendition that we all have come to love. And she does just a tremendous job. I mean, how many of you heard the Whitney Houston version or watched it live that day of the Super Bowl? I did. I mean, it was just, I mean, it just tears your heart out because she did such a wonderful job of it. And then on the other side, when you look at my comments up there, and there's that Roseanne Barr at the baseball game where, of course, you know, she was so disrespectful to the flag and to the song itself when she misspoke, swore, and of course, you know, it caused her to be canceled at that time from her very successful TV show. She found it difficult to make a living, and then of course she figured out, well, I can behave myself now, and of course she went and did something. I don't remember why she got canceled, her show here recently. But you know, you get the idea here that over time, the cultural implications of the song and the flag have a direct bearing on how we feel about the country at that particular time. Oops, did I go too far? Hang on. No, I think that's right. Okay. Gotta get my notes again. Now, the national anthem and its meaning for today. Most of us, when we were elementary children, I'm trying to think how many years ago that is for me. My wife just said a lot. Yes, that would be true. And we do. We learn about Fort McHenry. And we learn about the Star-Spangled Banner from a completely historic process. I really would like to get one of my old history books from back then and figure out how it was actually portrayed, because when I gave up teaching when I retired, I didn't give it up, when I retired in 2010, I should have brought some books with me so I could figure out exactly how the interpretations of history has changed the event at Fort McHenry. We know that Francis Scott Key witnessed the bombardment. The British Navy was in the harbor. They were bent on revenge. Just a couple of weeks earlier, they had destroyed Washington, D.C. A lot of that was because they had lost the Revolutionary War. This was payback. And burning Washington to the ground was certainly uppermost in their mind. And they picked Baltimore. Baltimore was the third largest city in the United States at that time. Besides Philadelphia and New York, it was Baltimore, not Boston, believe it or not. But Baltimore was a huge harbor. And this is why the British were in Baltimore at that particular time. The United States Navy had its birth during the Revolutionary War. We all remember from our elementary history, John Paul Jones, "Don't give up the ship," which they have, a banner hanging at the military academy, the Naval Academy in Annapolis, where John Paul Jones is buried. He says, "Don't give up the ship." Well, the Stars and Stripes was something that he hadn't had on his ship at the time. But the Navy had evolved into a quick fleet of operating vessels. They mainly were privateers, was our Navy. And these privateers would raid British shipping up and down the coast. They would raid the shipping in Europe and in Canada. So they were really angry with the United States in terms of what was going on with the Navy. So, you know, he's standing there, first light, he's inspired to write that famous lyric. But what Americans don't know is that it was a broadside ballad, one of some topical songs. Back in the day, in that era of the late 1790s, early 1800s, up until really the Civil War, ballads were published and music was published. And a lot of it was based upon previously written themes. And that was true of the Star Spangled Banner. It was adapted from a drinking song that they brought over from London. An example is, of course, the one that's best known to us is Yankee Doodle Dandy, which was brought over and was made a hybrid of, joking about the British at that time. And we know that it's still a magnet for controversy. So who is Francis Scott Key? A little bit about the author here. Let me turn so I can see this. He was born in 1779 in Frederick, Maryland. His father fought in the Revolutionary War. His uncle was a British sympathizer. And the big issue of the day was slavery, because he lived in Maryland. Family was slave owners, and believe it or not, he was a slave owner. I don't think a lot of Americans really recognize that Francis Scott Key was a slave owner. In fact, but at the time of his death in 43, at age 63, he still held title to 6 slaves on the estate that he lived on in Maryland. He was an attorney where he became famous for freeing slaves in his lifetime. He's officially given credit for freeing 189 slaves and getting them their freedom, even though he held on to 6 slaves until the time of his particular death. So he was a real advocate at that time. Some of the other things that aren't well known is he worked on the Burr conspiracy. Not the shooting of Burr and Hamilton, but the Burr conspiracy, where Burr, after he was shunted out of being vice president, tried to do a takeover of Western territories out after the Louisiana Purchase, and to form a separate entity or country or territory, whatever word you would like to use. And of course he was unsuccessful, and Burr was exonerated of that particular thing. So he knew Aaron Burr. He argued a number of cases before the early Supreme Court. He was a leader of the American Colonization Society, which of course was an effort to take blacks, whether they were free or slaves, and move them back to Africa. He was a devout and prominent Episcopalian. He died at the home of his daughter Elizabeth in Baltimore from pleurisy at age 63. So a relatively young man, but for that age, not so much. Now, here's the interesting thing that people ask. So why was Key even there? Was he a soldier? And how did he find himself watching the bombardment? Well, he actually ends up going on board a ship out to the British fleet because he was under orders by President Madison, who wanted to free somebody that had been captured by the British. At that time, they would trade soldiers and sailors back and forth, and he was trying to negotiate this person's release. He was actually in the Army less than a year, probably even less than 6 months from what history tells us. He was a quartermaster, and then a month before the attack on Fort McHenry, when British troops marched almost unopposed and desecrated the capital, as we know, he was a runner. He was running messages between various elements of the Army, the Navy, and from President Madison. And this is how he ends up being on a British ship, going out to the British fleet to negotiate a mission to get the release of a Dr. William Banks, was the gentleman's name. And thus, he becomes a witness to what happens at Fort McHenry. So the heroes of Fort McHenry, well, as you can see, they were basically sitting ducks. How many of the audience here has been to Fort McHenry and seen, ooh, that's a good number. Honey, raise your hand. You went, okay. I drag her along. Wherever we travel, we always end up seeing some historical sites or museums. It's just something that, I love to do. I think she tolerates it. But she also likes it sometimes. We're going to Greece in May. And I promised her that, one of the statues there in the Greek Hellenic Museum in Athens, she will find a statue. Yeah, okay. It was strategic. The British could not take Baltimore unless the fort fell. After 25 hours of shelling and bombardment, the fort stood. And this is what Francis Scott Key talks about. He uses the song to talk about their bravery. And that, this is a theme that runs through the early history of our nation, that somehow or other, our nation was ordained by God to become the country that we became, based on freedom and liberty and individual rights. This is something that in the early part of our history is very, very important to the citizens. It's what binds them to the country. Another really good example of this feeling about being ordained by God as a special nation on earth was when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died just a couple hours from each other on July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And they really felt that way. One of the other interesting aspects is that the Marquis de Lafayette, when he came to America, he had the opportunity, because when he traveled around the nation on his tour, what was interesting is he was, again, hailed as a hero, but somehow or other he too had been ordained, because he was a last living link to George Washington, because he served on George Washington's staff. So very interesting how the nation and its history and the cultural history, how it connects to certain people and in certain ways. This is what he writes, bravery, heroism, God is smiling on the country, guarantee the promise of the country going forward, that spark of hope, that's what inspires him to write the Star-Spangled Banner. Okay, so let's put you on that day where he's on board the ship. He kept his eye on the flag. The size of the flag made it easier for him to follow. Now, why was the flag so enormous? Well, what your elementary school books and history taught you is really pretty accurate. It was commissioned by a general in command of the fort. In fact, the general who was in command, his last name is Armistead. And this is a very famous Virginia family. And Armistead will become famous, one of the relatives, during the Civil War, Lou Armistead, who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, in the family estate. He wanted the flag so large that the British could see from a distance. He thought it was a signal of resistance, a symbol, and that's what grabs us. That's the symbolic nature of the Star-Spangled Banner and the song and the flag. They thought it was going to be a quick victory. They had no respect for our Army and our Navy. But after 25 hours of battle, the surprise was, as you see in the song, and you hear in the song, the flag was still there, which meant the American resistance was still there. Let me just read something that comes from the book regarding this as he was witnessing it aboard ship. He's under guard, effectively a prisoner. It's horrific, the shelling that goes on, bomb after bomb. They weren't devastating because the fort was so well built, but he saw the rockets and the bombs going by. The high notes are the moments of tension for him, knowing that the soldiers, what they are facing. The flag becomes the symbol as a result of the battle. Now, we have to remember to ourselves is that there's no radio, there's no internet, There's no television. There's no coverage of the battle. What comes out of the battle 3 days later, which I said earlier, is the lyrics about how the heroes at Fort McHenry stood their ground. This enormous American flag stood after this battle. And this is how Americans learned about the battle, about the song, and about the flag. Let's talk a little bit about the flag itself. You know, I put in here some things which reminds us of some of the most important elements or events, it's probably a better word, where we see the flag. I know that the flag committee, Peter, some of these are going to be represented in the monument when it's finished in late fall, I believe. Long before it flew to the moon, it was on the moon, waved over the White House, or is folded into tight triangles, which still moves us. Whenever somebody who was a local veteran is interred, whether it be here locally, or at the Abraham Lincoln Cemetery, or at Arlington National Cemetery, or the Punch Bowl out at Pearl Harbor, out in Oahu. Before it sparked fiery congressional debates, and it did, over whether it should be adopted as the national flag, reached the North Pole or the summit of Mount Everest, before it became a symbol of the lapel pins that most Americans will wear, the flag, and of course probably one of the greatest renditions, or I should say, use the word rendition, but one of the great representations of the flag, the Marines in Iwo Jima at Mount Suribachi when they raise it that day. And again, that's a whole story in itself. So if you've never read Flags of Our Fathers, George, I'd be happy, and Stacy, to come back and talk about that. We could, you know, spend some time talking about it. There were a smaller flag, as the movie that Clint Eastwood did a few years ago. There was a small 3x5 flag. Well, they couldn't see it. So they ordered and had another one taken and put up. You can see both those flags, by the way, at the Marine Corps Museum. We see it everywhere. You know, when Memorial Day shows up here in the next couple of months, a lot of Americans will have the flag out in their front lawns, out on their yards. Our local Boy Scout troop goes throughout the community and puts flags out for people, and then gets them and puts them out for other dates that we emphasize where the flag should be shown. This is what the author talks about. This is the cultural history. You know, it can be a divisive symbol, but then again, for most Americans, it's a unifying symbol. The flag was $400 contract to put the flag together. I think it was like $408. And it was so big they had to lay it out on the floor of a brewery in Baltimore, which seems about right for Americans, you know, I guess. In 1998, Old Glory, as it was known, Stars and Stripes, was put into an opportunity where what they did with it is they restored it. It had laid and hung, which was the wrong way to do it, hanging it, because it put such tremendous pressure on the seams that it was unraveling. It had unraveled a great deal before that. When you take a look at it today, it's on a slant and it's laid flat, and that way you can see it. But in terms of keeping it restored so it doesn't deteriorate anymore, it'll continue to be there for future generations. To tell you how important this flag was, people used to take cuttings of the flag. It was in private hands for many, many years. It didn't actually get into the Smithsonian until after the beginning of the 20th century. I think it was around 1903 that the flag was finally put into the safe hands of the Smithsonian, and then they held it. One of the things that they found, when you look at the flag, you see the big tear right in the middle there. There's a big hole. One of the stars is missing. Somebody cut it out for themselves and took it as a souvenir. Wouldn't you just love to have that star? And put it, bring it, say, hey, guess what I found in my grandfather's closet in a shoebox? Seems like whenever we find things in shoeboxes, or we find things, it's usually in a shoebox. Who was the Secretary of State that had all that money? Paul in a shoebox. I keep asking my wife to buy shoes, and the shoeboxes, but all that's there is shoes. There's never any money. I don't understand.
When did that happen?
They don't know.
Was it in the museum?
No, it wasn't when it was in the hands of the museum. It was prior to that, where people had. That's why it's so short and some. When you take a look at it along the fringes and the sides, that's why it's incomplete and not all the way rolled out. So that's where it is today. It's high-tech, exposure to light, which was killing it, which is one of the reasons why when you go to Washington, go also to the National Archives to see the Declaration of Independence. You barely can see it anymore because it hung in the, I believe it was the Patent Office in Washington on a wall by a window under direct sunlight. So that washed it out. Well, the same thing was happening to the Stars and Stripes, Old Glory. It was being exposed to the elements and it was being destroyed until finally the family said that owned it, we're going to donate it to the Smithsonian, where of course it is today. So if you have valuable signatures, photographs, and you want to preserve it for the future, go and you can get preservation glass, which is a special glass that filters out light and other things. A lot of my and our family's memorabilia we have under preservation glass and restored it that way. So it's really important to do that. So let's move on. Any questions about the flag? Now again, I'm trying to remember everything in a quick read. George?
I'm going to throw
Of course you are.
a fact at you. The largest U.S. flags are called garrison flags, which I'm sure you know. And this particular flag was considered a large garrison flag. And they measure flags by the hoist, the vertical, and the fly, horizontal. This was 30 feet high on the hoist and 42 feet wide on the fly. So that is a really big flag. 30 feet by 42 feet.
It is, yeah. And it seems like it's in, you mentioned garrison, obviously a military posting is probably where those flags flew. You think of, what happened out at Fort Sumter when Major Anderson had to surrender the flag, but he took it with him. And then when they defeated the Confederates out at Charleston, he went and put it back up and flew it. And in fact, one of the first individuals to be killed in the Civil War was Alexandria, Virginia. I'm trying to remember my history here. He was a young lieutenant, and of course, being in Virginia, they were, of course, sympathetic to the Confederate cause. This young Illinois lieutenant put an American flag out the window, and then he was shot and killed because he did that. And legend has it that he is the first casualty of the American Army in the Civil War. Though again, that's, who knows? It's just conjecture or history or rumor, whatever it is. So the flag's been around. Key's lyrics poses questions. Oh, say can you see? Does that banner yet wave? Cleggy's Oh, say can you see raises important questions about the banner, what it means in 1814, and what it means to us today and why it matters. And there's 4 verses. How many knew there were 4 verses? 3, 4 people? Yeah, there's 4 verses. We never sing the 2nd verse, we never sing the 3rd verse, and we don't sing the 4th verse. You just don't see it. I don't even know if in our church hymnal, do you know? You were in choir. When we sing the Star Spangled Banner on the 4th of July, that Sunday before, do we sing the first? I don't think it's even, yeah, I don't remember if it is. The first verse, he asks, is the flag still there? The 2nd verse is about that on the shore, dimly seen through the mist, the flag is fluttering. He sees it through, I can't read my own writing here, excuse me, without going through a spyglass, catches the breeze. The 3rd verse is the most controversial and one that has always been left out because it talks about the British, as you can see, and the values. And the 4th verse is about triumph and hope. That's why they're left out. So I think maybe a lot of times when you see it in books or in being played, it'll be the 1st and the 4th lyrics and not the 2nd and the 3rd, because the 3rd is that most controversial one. Moving on. Okay. No, we're not moving on. Okay. So he gives us the story of when did it become the national anthem. Officially March 3rd, 1931. Now you would have thought that this song of the Star Spangled Banner would have been our national anthem way before that, but it was not. It was used at the beginning of the American Civil War on July 4th, 1861. By law, the number of stars on the flag is supposed to be adjusted to match the number of states. So the federal government does not recognize the states that succeeded from the Union at that particular time. So the sacrifices, the lives of the soldier fighting in the country to preserve the Union and slavery is what makes it sacred to us. So it was referred to as the national anthem as early as the 1830s, 100 years before it officially becomes the national anthem. Congress and Hoover, who signed the bill, came late to the party and recognized it, even though Americans had recognized it in their own ways and in their own communities and at their own events, that they would sing the lyrics to the Star Spangled Banner and honor the flag. So it was 1931. So I'm sure there'll be some sort of celebration in 8 years, right? 8 and 3 is 11. I think so. Okay. Now, there's always a lot of controversy, as Clagy points out. Is it a poem? Well, it's really not a poem. It looks like a poem, but when you look at the lyrics, it really is not, because there is a rhyme scheme that he uses as he's writing the words and he's writing the notes, but it is not a poem. And there's a lot of people that think it is, and there's a lot of controversy whether or not it is a poem. It was common in revolutionary and post-revolutionary periods to write songs that reflected moments of the time. Songwriting was alive as well. You took a melody that was well known and wrote new words to fit it. Again, what I mentioned earlier, Yankee Doodle Dandy, and then our music to the Star Spangled Banner originates and brought to America in 1790s. A drinking song. Now, let's talk about, again, the cultural aspect. Clagy devotes an entire chapter to the flag, to the singing of the Star Spangled Banner, and to sports. First time that we see it used with the flag and the song is a baseball game in Brooklyn in 1862. So it is baseball, the great American pastime that can be associated with the flag and the song. It's played for the first time in 1903 World Series. And from 1917 on, at every World Series game and opening day at baseball parks. Now, of course, we know it's played all the time and constantly. Where it really picks up steam is when public address systems were put into stadiums so that people could hear the song, the Star Spangled Banner, and sing along with it. So not until the 1920s when American arenas become electrified and you have PA systems. And then in the 1940s, 1945, right after the war, the National Football League begins using the national anthem at the start of every football game. We know it's a ritual at every sporting event. Of course, Babe Ruth back from the 1930s. And of course, you know, the controversy over standing, kneeling, Colin Kaepernick, San Francisco 49ers. You'll have to judge on your own, your feelings regarding, I hear that, regarding, you know, how you feel about the issue of kneeling, you know, when the song is being played, and out of respect for the country and for the heroes who died protecting our country. And then, of course, you've got protest and civil war, and civil rights. Again, during the 1960s, it became very, very prominent for the civil rights movement to use the flag as a form of protest. Dr. King, of course, I looked, you know, with Cleggie's book and online to see if there were any examples of Dr. King, you know, ever disrespecting the flag, and he did not, to the best of my knowledge. However, where you see a lot of cultural uproar and upheaval is during the same time period, a little bit later, when the Vietnam War was at its height. And, you know, a lot of young Americans did not want to go to Vietnam and serve. They didn't see the purpose of it. They didn't see how it was impacting the security of our nation. So there was a lot of flag burning that had gone on. Besides draft cards, the flag is burned. And of course, in 1972, right around that time, there's the famous case of Texas versus Johnson. It went all the way to the Supreme Court about flag burning. And can you burn the symbol of our nation? Which of course is tied into the song, the Star Spangled Banner. Can you burn the flag as a form of protest? And we know the answer to that. 5-4 decision, which still stands today. I'm kind of curious, since there's a 6-3 conservative majority on the court, if they would ever take a look at something like that and overturn it. But who knows? You know, again, that's up to your beliefs. It's up to you to decide whether you feel that this is a good purpose. Social protest and freedom of speech is how it ultimately displayed. That's why, you know, everybody that wears a baseball cap with the flag on the side, or shirts or pants or just about everything else. We were watching, we love The West Wing. How many folks like The West Wing? Really was a great show. There's one episode with Penn and Teller are on the show, and they're doing a birthday celebration. They're talking about the Star Spangled Banner, and they're saying, oh, long may it wave, and see, and they take the flag and they put it into a cone, and then Penn Jillette, the magician, all of a sudden disappears. And the staff, of course, goes crazy. What did he do to the flag? Here in the White House. So there's all this controversy. The whole episode is about social protest, freedom of speech. It's really an interesting episode. So if you ever get a chance to watch The West Wing, it's the one with Penn and Teller. And that concludes my presentation. Mark Cleggie will say, can you see cultural history of the Star Spangled Banner, and really about the flag as well. got plenty of time for questions, but I don't know if I can answer them all, but. Mr. Sheets.
Not so much a question, but your comment about the verses of the Star Spangled Banner that people find offensive. Illinois' state song is a similar situation. This also got 4 verses. Most people have never heard the second, third, or fourth verses. But I think it's the third verse. Doesn't seem so bad to me, but it talks about it harkens to the Civil War and the gray versus the blue. And I think at some point people decided we should stop talking about that. You know, it was very much the Civil War verse. Just as an FYI comparison between.
Is that why they're thinking about changing the flag? I know Batavia, by the way, had a flag contest through the Chamber of Commerce, and they had a number of people submit entries, and I understand that the committee that was selected to pick the winner has done so, and they're going to be announcing it, so look out on the interweb, you know, the various outlets through the chamber, newspapers when they make the announcements. Margaret Perot, who's the executive director, mentioned that the other day at a meeting that both George and I had attended, that they had picked that. And then, of course, right after that, I'm reading a newspaper, and there's a movement to change the Illinois flag. I don't know what's wrong with it. It looks fine to me.
It was changed during the Vietnam War. I think
Was it really?
the name Illinois was added to it because the soldiers who had it with them in Vietnam, it had the eagle and everything, but it didn't say Illinois on it. And I think they wanted to be able to have that, like, you know, hometown, home state pride. And so the name Illinois was added to the flag back during the Vietnam War.
Interesting.
I think they're announcing the winner of the Batavia Flag Contest on April 4th.
Ah, may the 4th be with you. Oh, that's May. Okay, sorry. All right.
Dan, when my dad was alive, my dad and brother were alive, they were very active in the appropriate removal of flags and how to destroy them and following a flag code of etiquette. And I mentioned how we desecrate it by the way we use it as clothing, etc., and that it goes against that code. And someone said, what code? Who cares? Is there a code?
That is a great question. I know that the VFW post, you can collect the flags and they will destroy. It has to be
Private.
Private.
It is not a public
Right.
display. Some people do that. They have a big celebration gathering, and that's the absolute wrong way to do
It
it.
is. Again, I can't answer completely other
there
than
is
what
a-
I just said.
Is there a document of some variety that people can obtain through the government that has the code, flag etiquette or
There
something?
may very well be. I see our executive director quickly looking at his phone to check out the answer to that. I think I'm going to go on, I'm going to take a bet here, 50-50. I'm going to take a chance. I think there is. I think there is a flag etiquette.
There's something in the Boy Scout manual.
There is.
That code, but there are rules, and at least Scout manual looked at one time that, and I think it still does.
I think
There's
it,
stuff on,
Everywhere.
there's stuff of information from the American Legion
yes.
and VFW, you know, it has to be above any other flag, no flag can be above it, it can't touch the ground. So I'm sure there's something in that.
There is a
law.
whole thing when you have several flags on the dais,
Right,
where it's
exactly.
positioned and
Right.
that type of thing. George?
There is a section in the U.S. Code about the flag that gives the talks of it. I don't have the whole text here, but it says there's just some interesting. I don't know if how regulatory these really are, but you're not supposed to lower it too fast. It says it should be raised briskly and lowered ceremoniously according to the U.S. flag code. Because it said the lowering process should take a while. But you're not supposed to lower when the sun goes down. It says when a patriotic effect is desired, you can display the flag 24 hours a day if it's properly illuminated at night by a light. So there's just a couple headlines. But there is a section on American flag etiquette that's found in the United States flag code. You cannot find a complete copy of it. There's a lot of etiquette that's published.
Right.
I think it's based on it.
Well, let me conclude and just say, if you watch again here the Super Bowl, Chris Stapleton, the country western musician and singer, when he did his rendition of the Star Spangled Banner and the flag at this year's Super Bowl, amazing, just amazing. So if you didn't see it, Google it, watch it on the YouTube. You'll be inspired. In fact, they focused on the Philadelphia coach who just could not stop. He was in tears. So the flag still inspires us. The song still motivates us because we're proud of what it represents and the unity that it brings together for our country. So thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.